Emily sat by the large window in her Manhattan penthouse, her eyes fixed on the city lights. The wine glass in her hand remained untouched, its deep red hue reflecting her silent thoughts. Loneliness had settled in as a constant presence, creeping into her life like an unwelcome guest. Mark, her husband, was away on yet another business trip, leaving nothing but an emptiness behind. She had grown accustomed to his absence, but that didn't make it any easier. Their marriage had once been different. In the early years, Mark had adored her, showering her with love and attention. As time passed, however, his focus shifted and his business consumed him, leaving Emily as an afterthought. She had once believed their love was indestructible, but now she wasn't so sure. The passion had faded, replaced by routine and distant conversations. Nights like this served as painful reminders of what she had lost. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Ryan walking in, his presence filling the room with effortless confidence. He moved with the ease of someone who knew they belonged wherever they went. Tall, with sharp features and a knowing smirk. He was nothing like Mark. Ryan had a way of making even the quietest moments feel intense. "Long night?" he asked, noticing the untouched wine. Emily managed a small smile, offering a quiet reply. "Something like that." Ryan dropped onto the couch across from her, stretching out as if he owned the space. "Dad called," he said casually. "He'll be gone another week." "Of course he will," Emily replied, forcing indifference. "Mark's business always comes first." She nodded, trying to look unaffected. "That doesn't surprise me," she added. Ryan observed her closely for a moment before speaking again. "You don't seem fine." She let out a dry laugh. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. Ryan shrugged slightly. Emily really looked at him then. He wasn't the same young man she remembered from before he moved in. The last time they had seen each other, he was still in college, full of reckless energy and ambition. Now he was more composed, self-assured, with a certain edge to him, something almost dangerous in the way he looked at her. She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how close he was. "It's nothing, really," she said. "Just overthinking." Ryan didn't press further, but his gaze lingered on her in a way that unsettled her. Over the next few days, Emily found herself inexplicably drawn to him. It wasn't anything inappropriate or intentional, just fleeting moments, conversations that stretched longer than they should, stolen glances when she thought he wasn't looking. He had a way of making her feel seen, something she hadn't experienced in years. She started paying more attention to her appearance around him. At first, it wasn't deliberate, but soon she found herself choosing outfits that accentuated her figure, fixing her hair with extra care. "It's harmless," she told herself. "A little attention won't hurt anyone." Ryan, for his part, seemed to notice. His compliments, though casual, carried an undertone she couldn't ignore. "That color looks good on you," he said one evening, his eyes lingering just a bit too long. She brushed it off with a laugh, pretending it didn't affect her. But it did. One evening, she decided to bake, something she hadn't done in a while. The silence in the house felt too heavy, and she needed something to distract her. She carefully prepared a rich chocolate cake, the scent filling the kitchen with warmth. As she finished, Ryan walked in, drawn by the aroma. "You bake?" he asked, genuinely surprised. Emily smirked, placing a plate in front of him. "I used to." Ryan took a bite, his expression shifting. "Damn, that's really good." Emily watched him, feeling something stir inside her at his reaction. It was a simple moment, innocent even, but the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken. "I'm full of surprises," she said lightly, though the words felt heavier than they should. Ryan's gaze met hers, unreadable. "I bet you are." A silence stretched between them, something unspoken hanging in the air. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to look away. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She told herself it was nothing, just a passing moment, but deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling restless. The atmosphere in the house felt different, charged with something she couldn't name. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but she knew that was a lie. Every interaction with Ryan seemed to carry an undercurrent of something unspoken, something dangerous. She had convinced herself it was harmless, that she was simply enjoying the attention. But the way her heart raced in his presence told a different story. Throughout the day, she found herself hyper-aware of him. The way he moved, the way he spoke. She noticed things she shouldn't. How his shirt clung to his toned frame, the deepening of his voice when he spoke to her. It wasn't just her imagination. There was something real there, and that terrified her. She tried to keep her distance, but it was impossible. The house was too big, yet it felt suffocating when he was near. Every time she walked into a room, he was there, lounging on the couch, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His presence alone unsettled her. That evening, she was in the kitchen, lost in thought when she felt him behind her. Too close. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice low. She forced a smile, keeping her focus on the cutting board. Just tired. Ryan didn't move. He stood there, the heat of his presence pressing against her back. "Is that all?" he asked. Her grip tightened on the knife. What else would it be? A long pause followed. "I don't know. You tell me." She turned to face him, her heart pounding. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't understand. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something darker. Something knowing. "You're imagining things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan smirked, but there was no humor in it. "If you say so." He stepped back, giving her space, but the damage had already been done. The tension was there. Heavy. Undeniable. Emily let out a shaky breath, telling herself that this was getting out of hand. Over the next few days, she tried to ignore it. She avoided being alone with him, kept their conversations short, but it only made things worse. Ryan wasn't backing off. He was watching her, waiting. And part of her, the part she hated to admit, was waiting too. Then came the night when everything changed. It was late, the house quiet. Emily sat on the couch, a book in her hands, though she wasn't really reading. She heard footsteps behind her and knew it was him before she even turned. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. Ryan sat down beside her, closer than he should have. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. She should have moved, should have left the room, but she didn't. "You don't have to pretend," he said suddenly. She frowned, turning to face him. "Pretend what? That you don't feel it." Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to deny it, to shut it down, but the words wouldn't come. Ryan leaned in slightly, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "I see the way you look at me," he said, "the way you try not to." She swallowed hard. "This is wrong," she whispered. Ryan tilted his head, studying her with that unreadable expression. She stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "This isn't happening." Ryan didn't try to stop her. He just sat there watching her, that same expression on his face. "If you say so." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding, but deep down she knew the truth. The line had already been crossed. Emily couldn't think clearly. The weight of what had been building between her and Ryan was suffocating. Every breath felt heavy, every glance exchanged filled with something she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was just tension, that it would pass if she kept her distance. But it wasn't that simple. It had already gone too far. That night, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. Rain hammered against the windows, and the house felt colder than usual. She stood in the dimly lit kitchen, gripping the counter, trying to steady herself. She needed to regain control. She needed to stop this before it destroyed everything. Footsteps approached. She knew it was him before he even spoke. "You're avoiding me," Ryan said from the doorway. Emily exhaled slowly, keeping her back to him. "I think that's for the best." "Why?" he asked, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You know why." Emily turned to meet his gaze. "I think you don't really want that." Her chest tightened. "You have no idea what I want," she said. Ryan's smirk was subtle, but it sent a shiver down her spine. I think I do. She should have walked away. She should have put an end to it right then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she let the silence stretch, letting the moment hang between them like an unanswered question. Then it happened. An irreversible decision. A single moment that shattered the fragile barrier she had tried to keep intact. It was electric, intoxicating, terrifying. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body betrayed her. Every touch, every breath between them was a mistake she knew she would regret. But in that moment, regret didn't matter. She pulled away, breathless, her heart racing. The room felt smaller, suffocating. "This was wrong," she whispered, her voice shaky. Ryan studied her, his face unreadable. "Was it?" She took a step back, shaking her head. "This can't happen again." His silence was unsettling, and for the first time, she couldn't read him. Then, just as quickly as the moment had escalated, everything fell apart. Ryan exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter, his eyes darkening. "You really thought this was something real, didn't you?" Her stomach sank. He tilted his head, the smirk returning, but this time it was cold and calculating. "I knew," he said simply. "I knew from the start." Her pulse quickened as he spoke again, his words casual. "What? That you wanted me?" He said it like it was obvious. "I just needed to see if you'd actually go through with it." Her breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Ryan exhaled, looking almost amused. "I never planned for this to happen, but when I saw the way you looked at me, how you tried to hide it, I got curious. I wanted to see how far you'd go." Emily felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "You were testing me?" He didn't respond, but his silence said everything. A wave of nausea hit her as she gripped the counter to steady herself. "This was just a game to you?" Ryan's expression softened, but it wasn't sympathy. It was worse. It was pity. "You let it happen, Emily. You wanted it just as much as I did." Her stomach twisted. The shame, the regret, it was overwhelming. "I ruined everything." He didn't argue. She turned away, her mind racing. How had it come to this? How had she been so blind? Ryan sighed. "Don't worry, I'm not going to say anything." But that wasn't the point. The damage was already done. Even if no one else found out, she would have to live with this. The betrayal, the humiliation, the shame. It would never leave. She forced herself to face him one last time. The boy she thought she knew was gone. In his place stood a man who had seen her at her weakest, tested her, and watched her fail. Without saying another word, she walked away, leaving behind the biggest mistake of her life. Emily hardly recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Her reflection was empty, stripped of the confidence she once had. The weight of her decisions bore down on her, suffocating her in a way she never thought possible. She had told herself that what happened with Ryan was inevitable, that she had just lost control for a moment. But now, standing there, she knew the truth. It hadn't been a single moment. It had been a series of choices, each one leading her deeper into a path she could never undo. Days passed, but nothing felt real. Ryan distanced himself, no longer hanging around the house or giving her those knowing smirks. It was as if she no longer existed, and maybe, in a way, she didn't. The version of her who had walked into this house months ago, thinking she was just an ignored wife with a lonely heart, was gone. Mark noticed the change. He wasn't blind, despite how much she had convinced herself he was. One night, as they sat across from each other at dinner, he finally spoke. "You've been different lately." Emily forced a smile. "Just tired." Mark put his fork down and studied her. "Is it something I did?" The question hit harder than she expected. She had spent so long blaming him for the distance between them, convincing herself that his neglect had pushed her into someone else's arms. But as she looked at the man who had trusted her, without question, she realized she couldn't blame anyone but herself. "No," she whispered. "It's not you." He nodded slowly, but the uncertainty in his eyes remained. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't know what it was. Emily knew it was only a matter of time before the truth reached him. Ryan was leaving. She overheard him on the phone, making arrangements to move out. She should have felt relieved, but all she felt was dread. The night before he left, she found him sitting on the balcony, looking out at the city. For a moment, she considered walking away, but something inside told her she needed to face this. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Ryan didn't look at her. "Yeah, I think it's time." She swallowed hard. "I never meant—" He interrupted her. "We both know what happened. No point pretending." She closed her eyes, shame flooding her once again. "I don't know how to fix this." Ryan finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You don't." Her throat tightened. "I wish I could take it back." He exhaled, shaking his head. "That's the thing, Emily. You can't—" She wanted to say more, to explain, to justify, but there were no justifications left. He stood, grabbed his drink, and walked past her. "Goodbye, Emily." And just like that, he was gone. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been. She had lost him. But worse than that, she had lost herself. A week later, Mark confronted her. He had found out, not from Ryan, but from her own guilt. He had seen it in her distant stares, the way she recoiled from his touch, the way she avoided his eyes. "Is there something you need to tell me?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Emily's chest tightened. She could have lied. She could have denied everything. But she was too tired to pretend anymore. "Yes," she whispered. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mark didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Disappointment. "I don't even know who you are," he said finally. Neither did she. The divorce papers came a month later. She didn't fight them. She didn't beg. She knew she had already lost. As she packed her things, preparing to leave the home she had once thought would be forever, she reflected on all the moments that had led her here. All the choices she had made, all the times she had ignored the warning signs. Temptation had been a test, and she had failed. There was no excitement now, no thrill, only regret. Some betrayals can be forgiven, but others leave scars that never fade. And some mistakes cost more than anyone is willing to pay. Emily had lost everything. And for what? At the bustling train station in Nairobi, Jane Bennett struggled with her suitcase, a burden symbolizing the emotional weight she had been carrying ever since her husband's betrayal. Her trip to Africa was meant to be a healing experience, but soon frustration overwhelmed her. Just as she was about to give in, a warm voice cut through the noise. "Allow me to help you," said a tall man with a friendly smile. As she turned, she saw Charles, a local teacher who easily lifted her suitcase, his calm confidence easing her anxiety. His English was perfect, his accent pleasant and clear. "You seem like you've had a long day," he remarked. Jane nodded, offering a reluctant smile. "You could say that," she replied. As they made their way toward the platform, Charles began a conversation about the city's rich history, vibrant culture, and his work with children. Jane relaxed, drawn in by his enthusiasm. "What brings you here?" he asked. Jane paused before responding. "I guess I'm searching for something or trying to escape something." Charles didn't press further, but instead offered helpful suggestions about what to see and avoid in the area. Jane was taken aback by his kindness, especially toward a stranger. When she asked why he was so willing to help, he simply answered, "Kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything to someone." As she boarded the train, Jane felt thankful for his company, even if just for a short time. They sat across from each other, the rhythmic sound of the train providing a backdrop to their conversation. Jane found herself sharing more about her life than she had planned: the betrayal of her late husband, her decision to embrace solitude, and her journey to rediscover herself. Charles listened closely, his dark eyes filled with empathy. He shared bits of his own story, including his disappointments, yet he remained hopeful. Jane admired his resilience. By the time they reached their destination, Jane felt a shift within her. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The stranger's kindness, his ability to listen without judgment, and the warmth he exuded planted a small seed of trust in her heart. As they parted for the night, Charles looked back and said, "Sometimes journeys surprise us in ways we don't expect. I hope this one does for you." Jane watched him walk away, a flicker of hope stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. As Jane and Charles spent more time together, an undeniable bond began to grow. They enjoyed quiet moments and conversations that stretched longer than expected. Jane started looking forward to their time together, whether they were talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. The dynamic between them gradually shifted from mere friendship to something deeper, an acknowledgement Jane wasn't yet prepared to label. Charles noticed this change too. He admired Jane's quiet strength and resilience. At 65, she radiated grace and wisdom born from years of enduring heartache and facing life's challenges. Yet, behind her composed exterior, he sensed her vulnerability. Although she rarely spoke about her late husband, whenever she did, he could see the pain in her eyes. Despite the warmth between them, Jane remained cautious. The scars from her past were still fresh, and while Charles was kind and caring, he was still a stranger. She questioned whether her feelings for him were born from loneliness or something deeper. One evening, by the lake, as they watched the sunset, Jane reflected on the growing intimacy between them. This attraction was unexpected and almost unsettling. Charles had a gentle way about him that made her feel safe, an emotion that had eluded her for so long. Charles, too, found himself drawn to Jane in ways he hadn't anticipated. He admired her wisdom, strength, and warmth. There was something about her that eased his own unresolved pain. He realized he enjoyed her company beyond mere obligation or friendship, sensing a deeper connection, although he wasn't yet ready to fully confront it. Neither of them voiced these feelings, but their bond was quietly growing, with an unspoken understanding of their mutual care for each other. They hesitated to address the complexities that these unacknowledged feelings might bring, but with each shared moment, it became clearer that Jane and Charles were no longer just strangers on a journey. They were two souls intertwining in ways neither had expected. After their arrival in the city, the atmosphere between them shifted. What had started as innocent companionship now felt more complicated. Jane noticed something that unsettled her. Charles had run into an old acquaintance, a woman named Lucia. Their brief exchange was friendly, but loaded with familiarity. Jane couldn't ignore the pang of jealousy that twisted in her chest. It felt strange. She had no right to feel this way, yet the unease lingered. The following days were filled with awkwardness. Jane observed how Charles and Lucia interacted. There was an ease between them, a shared history that Jane couldn't ignore. She tried to push these feelings aside, convincing herself it was just her insecurities surfacing. But every time Lucia appeared, she felt the distance growing between her and Charles. One afternoon, as they sat in a cafe, Jane watched Charles and Lucia chatting animatedly, as if no time had passed since their last meeting. There was something in the way Lucia smiled at Charles that made Jane feel like an outsider. She tried to dismiss it, but it was hard not to feel like she was intruding on something that belonged to them, something Jane had no right to. When Charles finally returned to her, he seemed distracted. He apologized for the length of his conversation with Lucia, explaining that they had once been close. Jane nodded, forcing a smile, but inside she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something was happening, and she couldn't quite understand it. That night, Jane confronted Charles. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine when the situation felt so far from it. She demanded to know what was happening between him and Lucia. The words came out more sharply than she intended, but the hurt had been building up, and now it was spilling over. Charles looked surprised, trying to explain himself, but his words didn't ease her pain. "She's just an old friend," he said, but Jane wasn't convinced. She wanted to believe him, but everything inside her told her there was more to the story. "I don't want to be part of some complicated situation," Jane said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be a distraction to you." Charles reached for her hand, but Jane pulled away. It wasn't just jealousy that made her pull back. It was the painful realization that she had allowed herself to care for him more than she had intended. And now, seeing him with Lucia, the walls around her heart began to crumble. "I never meant for this to happen," Charles said gently, "but I don't want you to leave." Jane's heart ached, but she knew something had changed. Whether it was her own insecurities or the reality of the situation, she couldn't ignore the doubt that had settled in her chest. She needed space to think, to understand what was really happening between them. The next day, Jane made up her mind. She would continue her journey alone, away from the confusion of her feelings for Charles. She packed her things quietly, unable to look at him without feeling a mix of hurt and longing. Charles tried to stop her, but Jane remained firm. There was too much confusion, too much uncertainty now. She had been betrayed before, and the possibility of it happening again was too much to bear. She had to walk away, even if it meant leaving behind something that might have been beautiful, something she had started to believe in. As she walked away, Charles stood there watching her go, regret filling his eyes. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but in failing to be honest with her, he had. And now he realized it might be too late to undo the damage. Days passed, and Jane couldn't shake the sense of loss that followed her after leaving Charles. The journey she had set out on to find peace now felt empty. Her heart weighed heavily with unanswered questions, and the memory of their shared moments lingered like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had tried to distance herself from the pain, but the bond they had shared wouldn't fade. Even though she had walked away, a part of her still longed for the warmth he had brought into her life. Meanwhile, Charles was consumed by regret. The distance between them felt like an unbridgeable gap. He had thought he could manage his feelings, that he could simply help Jane without getting attached. But he was wrong. The moment she left, he realized just how deeply he had come to care for her. His failure to communicate, to be honest about the feelings he had for her, had caused irreversible harm. His regret wasn't just about losing her. It was about betraying her trust. Charles spent hours reflecting on what had gone wrong. He realized that in his hesitation to confront his own emotions, he had pushed Jane away. He had been so focused on the past, on Lucia and their shared history, that he hadn't recognized what was developing right in front of him. He missed Jane. Her laughter, her presence, the way she saw the world. It was too late now, but he couldn't let her go without trying to make things right. He wrote her a letter, pouring out his heart. In it, he explained his feelings, apologized for the confusion and the pain he had caused, and admitted that his silence had been driven by his own fears. Fear of opening himself up to something that might hurt him again. But now, he knew he couldn't let her slip away without doing everything he could to fix things. Jane received the letter one quiet afternoon. As she read it, a familiar ache settled in her chest. The words spoke of regret, vulnerability, and a man who had been too afraid to admit his feelings for far too long. She simply sat with the letter in her hands, unsure of how to respond. There was a part of her that wanted to close herself off completely to protect her heart from more pain, but another part of her, the part that had seen Charles' kindness and had shared in the tenderness of their time together, couldn't just turn her back on him. The following morning, Jane visited the art gallery where they had shared some of their most intimate moments. She had made a decision. It wasn't about forgetting the pain, but about allowing herself to move beyond it. She had come to understand that love, though complicated, was something worth taking risks for, even if it meant stepping into the unknown once more. When they met, there were no words at first. They simply looked at each other, each carrying the weight of their shared history and the unspoken feelings that had bloomed between them. Charles, vulnerable and open, spoke first. "I've spent so many days regretting how I treated you," he said softly. "But I want to make it right. I want to try again. I want us to see where this could go." Jane, her heart torn, finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forget the hurt, Charles, but I'm willing to see where this can go too, if you're willing to fight for it." They both understood that love wasn't just about the moments of happiness, but about working through the pain, misunderstandings, and fears. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had both been through enough to know that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to allow yourself to love again, despite the risks. As they walked side by side, no longer strangers or hesitant companions, but partners, Jane knew this journey was just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she believed in the possibility of a new chapter, one filled with trust, growth, and perhaps a love that could heal them both.